After someone has decided they're going to make something, they have to overcome one of the largest hurdles in the path to completing that project. Where to start? Which part of the project is the best to act as a foundation for the rest to build on top of? For a video game, there are a lot of options. The programming team may need to construct a new engine, or get a key mechanic functioning that will go on to inform everything else. Perhaps the art team has a collection of assets that just have to be in the game, or a style that's so new and refreshing that it's destined to become the center of the project. Maybe a director lays out a map of their ideal first level, or hands their department heads a written script to base their work off of. In any case, something has to come first, and define the game's direction throughout production. In From Software's 1995 game, King's Field, the driving component behind the game's production isn't obvious, and only after putting some considerable thought into it have I been able to develop a theory. King's Field contains level design that the player character is not equipped to overcome, enemies that aren't conventionally battled with, a questionable definition of optimization, and a suggestion of a narrative that ends in a way that nobody could have ever expected. And yet, the game is a sequel. Someone at From Software had a vision for a 3D game with no loading screens, full of traps and secrets, and they wanted it as soon as the technology was there. They were going to make it irrespective of the rest of the game's design. King's Field is defined by its level design. For better or worse, the game is exactly what it was meant to be. And it's brilliant. The footage for this video was recorded on stream. To be notified whenever I go live, as well as to chat about games and videos, join the Discord in the description. Dude, the texture... Oh! Jesus! Alright. In 1994, a small Japanese software company made the jump into the video game market. The advent of affordable 3D development tools meant that the barrier to entry was fairly low, and small companies weren't risking too much by dipping their toe into the medium. That team of software engineers managed to get a development build of Sony's new PlayStation, and were ready to drop their 3D dungeon exploration game 2 weeks after the console launched. King's Field was relatively well received by the Japanese audience, though there were certainly detractors. The game was much more difficult than its contemporaries, which left many unimpressed. Reviews said it relied too heavily on secret items and keys, in similar-looking hallways filled with enemies that were challenging to defeat. Many were still coming to grips with the idea of a 3D video game, and From Software were out here punishing the player for falling into a pit that may have contained a secret or an item required to progress. 6 months later, the team had a new game built in the same engine, and the reception in Japan was significantly better. While the first King's Field game had been cryptic and impenetrable, the sequel was far easier to understand while still offering a challenge. The game's reception was so positive that the developer was approached by multimedia corporation
ASCII Entertainment
in order to gain international publishing rights for King's Field, which From Software accepted. King's Field 2 would be translated to English and released in the US in February of 1996 to middling reviews. The game's poor frame rate and challenging combat were again criticized, but the setting and expansiveness of the game world received great commendation. Melanat is the name of the island that the player has washed up onto. It's an isolated rock in the middle of the ocean that is difficult to get onto and off of, and as a result, the people of Melanat cannot leave. A fisherman near the player's starting location explains this in a fairly roundabout way, but he also claims that many of the island's residents are trapped on the island because of an addiction to the crystals that can be found deep underground. There are a handful of villages on Melanat, in which the player can find more people to speak with, as well as a few of the island's magical fountains. The water that springs from these fountains has a high concentration of crystal dust that heals the drinker when consumed, which is likely the reason the inhabitants are addicted. Deeper beneath Melanat resides the vast majority of other people on the island, members of an army that had begun mining for the crystals to move back to the mainland, now lost to their enveloping need to consume them. The player can find these crystals scattered throughout Melanat and use them for trade, or have a craftsman fashion a crystal flask to hold some of the magical water to consume during battle. The player rarely gets to see the sky as they explore the island. Most of the pathways are a knot of tunnels that meander between larger rooms, but there are a few bridges and the ridiculous minecart network deeper down. The mines and lower tunnels extend far deeper than I expected them to, and it becomes quite difficult to remember where things are located, as the paths overlap and they spiral around each other. The presence of enemies and other obstacles in these tunnels can also impact the player's ability to memorize the path they took, and the maps the player can find are not particularly helpful either. The level design in Kingsfield contains a number of quirks that give the game an isolating atmosphere, while it also includes some things specifically to be kind of rude to the player. The game opens on the beach, on a small rock surrounded by shallow water. Except, it isn't all shallow. It's actually much more precarious than it looks, and it's a great example for the way the rest of the game will function. The player is always teetering on the edge of destruction, whether they know it or not. There's a massive play space in this game. I spent about 18 hours with Kingsfield, and the majority of that time was spent navigating and trying to figure out where the game wanted me to go. And while it appears to be open for exploration, Melanat won't allow the player into places they aren't ready to go, whether that involves killing the player immediately upon entering a new location, or simply locking a door that leads deeper. Right across from the starting rock is a doorway into the island. Inside there are a few enemies to fight, as well as a collection of barrels to rummage through for loot. This room also contains a well filled with Melanat's magical water, which the player can use to heal, offering a kind of base to make excursions away from for the first few minutes of the game. Right beside the well is a false wall. It doesn't look any different to the other walls in the room, though the player might notice the texture warp or the geometry flicker, which I don't think was deliberate, but it does show that there are secrets hidden behind some of the walls. In this first room alone, the player has experienced combat, recovered from any damage they may have taken, found a piece of armor in a container that isn't a treasure chest, and learned that there are secrets to find by interacting with the walls. This is all fantastic stuff, but this area asks far too much of the hardware, which is another key aspect of the game introduced at this stage. As the levels become more complex, or they start to contain more enemies and traps, things start to get very clumsy. Not only for performance problems, but also in terms of the challenges presented to the player. The character's mechanical capability is fairly limited. They can walk, or they can run at the cost of stamina, but there isn't a jump. They can equip and swing a variety of weapons, but the equipable shields are only increases to the defensive stats. There isn't a button to raise the shield to block some incoming damage, so when the level includes pendulum traps that occupy the entire hallway, the player has no choice but to get smacked if they try to pass through. And while some of these traps can be deactivated via a switch somewhere, sometimes that switch is beyond the trap. Similar situations can arise from invisible pits throughout the game, although with some luck the player can run across these. I don't find these things to be bad choices, but they are strange. Kingsfield is quite good at telling the player they're unwelcome in one location, and that they should look elsewhere to progress. So when I was hit for 100 damage by these swinging spiked balls, I felt incentivized to look elsewhere. The game's combat also adds to this incentive. Without a dedicated button for blocking or dodging, the player's best option to avoid damage in battle is to move away from the enemy, or to circle around and get behind them, which the controls don't make comfortable. Kingsfield uses tank controls with the R1 and L1 buttons used for strafing, which I'm totally fine with. This control scheme works for exploring and combat against regular enemies, scenarios where the stakes are low, and there are plenty of escape routes if things do get out of control. It is possible to add an item to a shortcut button to use when necessary, which I would typically assign my crystal bottles to heal from. A single offensive spell is assigned to another button, and the player has to cast other spells from the spell menu directly. Magic is a surprisingly important part of Kingsfield combat, particularly when battling the game's bosses. Hits cause a not insignificant period of stun on enemies, which heavily factored into my preference for which offensive spells to use. Even if it did the least amount of damage, the Fire Wall spell hits enemies multiple times, which allows for safe approaches and some free sword damage. Without sufficient resources to cast this spell repeatedly, the player has to choose between tanking a lot of damage or circling around the enemies endlessly until the battle ends. This strafing strategy is very effective against most of the enemies in the game, though I found it to be sort of uncomfortable to use. In order to circle around an enemy, the player has to input one of the shoulder buttons, and then wiggle between the up and horizontal direction on the D-pad. It's easy to make a mistake here, which can leave the player vulnerable to an attack. I didn't find doing this to be fun. I found it to be funny, because it's very silly, but it certainly wasn't fun. There are 8 bosses throughout Kingsfield, though there are a few rematches here and there, bringing the total number of boss battles to 11. Most of the bosses are larger versions of regular enemies, though they usually have attacks in boss form that they wouldn't have otherwise. The first boss the player is likely to encounter is the big squid enemy near where the player awakens at the start of the game. This guy is far beyond the player's capability when they first find it, and I struggled to defeat it as the third boss I took down. The huge kraken has a massive pool of health that causes the fight to take a long time even if the player is prepared for the battle. The boss cannot move and instead flails its enormous tentacles at the player, hoping to knock them into the deep ocean just in front of the kraken's lair. This fight is frighteningly familiar, actually. Most of the other bosses in Kingsfield aren't rooted in place like the kraken, although the termite queen is. It's strange that she can only be damaged via projectile weapons and magic, and the enemy pathing problems make this battle quite disappointing. Enemies cannot leave the room they're assigned to, even if there's nothing that would keep them from leaving. So it's possible and practical to defeat the termite queen from outside of the room, since the termites she summons can't actually reach the player. The necessity of projectile attacks for this battle also doesn't really make sense. The queen is standing in a hallway, near enough that the sword swings should be able to hit her no problem, but they just don't work. So the player has to leave and find a bow and some arrows in order to defeat this boss. Almost every other boss is a mobile enemy that can be circled around to varying levels of effectiveness. The Bronze Knights and the Huge Tarn have relatively slow turning speeds, so once the player gets behind them, then the fight is essentially over. The Earth Elemental, the Demon Lord, and Necron aren't so slow, so there's less opportunity to lock them down with backstabs. Of course, the Firewall spell does keep these enemies in hit stun for a bit, but nowhere near long enough for the player to be able to keep them permanently stunned until death. These 3 enemies are also the back end of a boss rush toward the end of the game, and they don't go down effortlessly. Necron might even be a bit overtuned, especially since the game doesn't run great in his arena. I think vision and ambition have blinded the developers to the biggest problem within their game. All of these corridors, traps, enemies, and the choice to never use loading screens come at the cost of the game's frame rate. And in some instances, the gameplay suffers tremendously. There are many enemies in Kingsfield which have a wind-up animation linked to their primary attack. This signals to the player that the enemy is about to deal damage to them, and that the player should prepare to get hit, or move out of the attack's damage zone. Skeletons are a great enemy type to demonstrate this, as they have to lift their sword before they can attack. In some locations, a skeleton moves rather quickly, so the player has to be watchful of them, and try to take them down as soon as possible. Unchecked, a lone skeleton can deal significant damage to the player, but since the game is running at its best, the player can react accordingly and eliminate the threat while taking minimal damage. Towards the middle of the game, particularly around the big castle structure in the center of the island, the game runs much worse. These skeletons don't have any design differences to the previous ones, but since the player can't turn as quickly, and there's a longer period of input delay, they're actually more dangerous than before. Fortunately, the location that runs the poorest is free of any enemy presence at all, since the player will return there frequently to heal and regain their magic points. It's a nice looking room, but I can't help but think a pause to load every so often, and loading less, would have greatly benefited the experience overall. I played Kingsfield on an original PlayStation, and translated the AV signal to an HDMI signal in order to record this footage. So the resolution is low. Luckily, there isn't much to see here. It's a PlayStation game, so I wasn't expecting the poly counts to be high, but these environments managed to exceed my expectations. There are a lot of flat corridors with some middling texture to differentiate the various regions throughout Melanat. There's a lot of this stone texture early on, and it reappears toward the end of the game too. Then there are these strange snotty corridors that I guess are supposed to be covered in moss or algae. Kingsfield doesn't look too bad compared to its competition at release, but with the Nintendo 64's launch in 1996, as well as the drastically improved visuals of fully 3D PlayStation games like Crash Bandicoot, and the pre-rendered graphics like those of Resident Evil, Kingsfield falls far short. It's very likely From Software didn't actually have official artists on staff by this stage, and their programming team is probably the ones responsible for the game's presentation. Oddly then, the music is amazing. It's moody, and it does a lot to set the tone of the game's locations, something the visuals can't quite manage on their own. When combined with the way sounds carry down the hallways, the atmosphere leaves the player nervous, like they've swum too far away from shore, while something lurks beneath. From Software has never really done direct storytelling in their games, and yet Kingsfield is no exception. But there is a bit of lore to explore to contextualize some of the major events. Necron and his followers had been part of an army sent to the island to begin mining and exporting the powerful crystals that can be found there. The army had sent some supporting civilians too to manage the daily lives while the main force mined. Before long, almost everyone on Melanat had succumbed to their crystal addiction, and crystal loads stopped being delivered to the mainland. The crystals aren't magically powerful for no reason, however. Long before Necron's army had landed on Melanat, the island had been home to a small elven civilization. The elves were mainly responsible for the many routes around the island, and they were also the ones to leave much of the magic power behind. Their deities, 2 dragons, were the ones to bestow the crystals upon the elves. Seath received much adoration from his subjects, and Gyra grew jealous. Gyra created the crystals, empowering the elves, but also lashing them together. Eventually, the elves were destroyed by their own addiction, and Gyra fled into the sky, while Seath did what they could to try and pick up the pieces. Functional, I'd say. Any context is welcome, and I'm very happy for there to be something to explain what the whole deal was with the ending, because as it stands, it's quite the departure. With Necron defeated, the player can access a pair of portals that both lead to what appears to be a space station filled with robotic versions of enemies found down on Melanat. After progressing through the maze of corridors and portals, the player enters an open area. This is the stage for the final battle against Gyra, and it's certainly an experience. The translucent platform is pretty funny, and the dragon model doesn't match it at all. If Gyra had been in a room somewhere on Melanat, it'd look appropriate. But out here on the ISS chessboard, it makes this area look unfinished. The actual mechanics of the fight are very King's Field. Gyra doesn't move, and it has a handful of super powerful attacks that are totally nullified by standing in a specific location in the room. There is another layer to the fight though. Gyra is accompanied by a bunch of yellow orbs that shoot lasers and absorb all of the player's magic. Where other boss encounters in the game are mechanically closer to powered up regular enemies, Gyra is distinctly a boss encounter, almost like an MMO encounter, in how the player has to manage a mechanic before the actual target of the battle is vulnerable. There is a finite quantity of orbs in the room though, and I think I'd have preferred having fewer in the room at the start, and spawning more as the fight goes on. That way the fight at least maintains a level of challenge as the player progresses through it, instead of there being a high likelihood of death at the start of the fight, but it gradually diminishes over time, to the point where the player is just whacking the dragon with nothing to threaten them. Well, for the rest of the fight, aside from their own hubris. I'm gonna resist the urge to get bored and hit him. I'm just gonna stay safe. And for the rest of the fight, he has no reason to use like, I'm assuming he has like 1,000 health or something, and I'm doing like 10 damage a tick. What? He never did that before. So King's Field is defined by its level design. A gigantic proportion of the game's content, as well as the PlayStation's processing capacity, consists of walking through the island while searching for the path deeper. The environment itself holds a majority of King's Field's secrets, and examining it will be the bulk of the player's activity. There are sometimes enemies within those environments, and sometimes those environments are designed to facilitate a more powerful opponent. But these things are more like distractions from the process of moving through the world. The non-player characters don't even tell the player where to go. The level design is entirely responsible for that, and the presentation couldn't use more of the console's processing power, because it was all needed to keep entire dungeons loaded so that there weren't any loading screens. Some psychopath was determined to make King's Field this way. They never cared to make concession for the sake of performance or accessibility. King's Field's stubbornness turned many potential audience members away, but the final product is the designer's strongest desire. And it's brilliant. another legend next time.